Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe. I'm your host for this week, and as always, I'm joined by my college friend Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. So Mark, welcome to our 4th annual holiday edition of Mansplaining.
Yes.
This tradition is kind of developed organically. I think the first year you asked me a question about Christmas, and I asked you about New Year's Day, and we also discussed happy news,
Yes.
things we could be happy about amidst the unrelenting gloom of the modern world. And that brings us to this year when I asked a question about thankfulness. This is kind of more of a personal subject than most prior editions of Mansplaining. And for that reason, I think we decided that we would both answer this question. So
Yes.
We'll start with you, Mark. What are you most thankful for in this holiday season, and why?
Well, thank you, Joe, for posing this question. And it's really one that set me down a path. On the one hand, I feel it's easier to come up with answers to the question. I'm thankful for my wife. I'm thankful for my health. I'm thankful that I have money in the bank when so many people in this world live day to day. Those are the easy answers. I can explain why I'm thankful for those things in just a few sentences. But I wanted to go a little deeper, so I spent several days just reflecting on the question and asking what I'm really thankful for. And I wanted it to be something that someone else did that benefited me in some way, rather than just being thankful for the sunrise or something like that.
Right.
So again, I gave it a lot of thought. What I came up with is something that I have complicated feelings about, which I'll get into later. But with that as a preamble, let's get started. My story begins the summer after kindergarten. My birthday is in September, and I turned 6 right around the start of the school year. I didn't go on to first grade, though, with the other kids. I spent the next year at another school, essentially repeating kindergarten. The reasons why I repeated kindergarten are important to the story, but for dramatic reasons, I'm going to reveal those details later in the story.
Okay.
I started elementary school the next year, and by then I was more or less 1 year older than the other kids. And I believe this gave me several advantages in life. Joe, have you ever read Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers?
I have not, but I've heard about it.
Yeah, so in Outliers, Gladwell writes about a very interesting study which built on the remarkable fact that a very large percentage of all professional hockey players in the NHL were born in the first 3 months of the year. On a monthly basis, January is the birth month with the most players in the NHL. February is the second most common birth month, and March is the third most common.
Wow, I didn't know that.
If birth date were totally random, you'd expect around 8 or 9% of players to be born in any given month, but instead, the distribution heavily favors the first few months of the year. And researchers trace the underlying cause of that odd fact to youth hockey. When you're young in Canada and in certain parts of the United States, you play hockey, just like you and I, Joe, played Little League Baseball. And youth players are assigned to certain levels based on their birth year. Hockey season starts in the fall. So if, like me, you were born in September and you joined a team of 6-year-olds, you'd be 6 years and 1 month old when play started. If you're born in January, however, you'd be 6 years and 10 or 11 months old. When you're 6 years old, 1 year makes a really big difference. You're taller, you're stronger, and you're more mature. Those things really work to your advantage in youth hockey. The older boys are more likely to be good at hockey. They'll get more playing time, and everyone around them will talk about how they're the best player on the team. And when there are training programs to identify talented young players and develop them into future professional players, they'll go with the kids who are excelling in youth programs. This is what researchers call, quote, the relative age effect, or the January effect for short. Those kids born in January will be at the head of the line for getting the coaching and investment a young player needs to eventually develop into a professional player. Now, this isn't to say that becoming a professional hockey player is simply a matter of being born in the right month. It also takes a lot of talent and a great deal of hard work. But what Gladwell convincingly argues is that being born in the month of January, February, and March gives certain young players a leg up, and those among them who also happen to be talented hard workers might take that early lucky break and turn it into a career in the NHL. It gives them an advantage over equally talented hardworking players who happen to be born later in the year, and that's why so many professional hockey players were born in January. So back to my story. Repeating kindergarten meant that I was a year older than the other kids in my first grade class, and pretty much right away I started hearing how I was special. Right off the bat, I was better than the other kids at reading. I became a favorite of my teachers. I got used to hearing from everyone around me that I was very smart, and that quickly became part of my identity. I was someone who did well in school, and every year as I progressed, I expected to keep doing well in school. And I did. I did very well in school, all the way through graduate school at prestigious institutions. And looking back at it now, that self-confidence was the biggest gift I could possibly have received. When you believe in yourself, every failure feels like a temporary setback. Failing at something just makes you work harder because you know deep down that you're good enough. I'm not saying that all of my academic success was because of the year I spent repeating kindergarten. I was probably going to be an intelligent kid no matter what, but that extra year at the beginning of my schooling gave me a head start, and, like those pro hockey players who were born in January, I just kept building on that early advantage. So much in my life depends on how that played out. I met my wife on the University of Chicago campus shortly before I finished my PhD. I've been hired for jobs on the basis of those 3 letters after my name, even if the job had nothing to do with what I studied in school. I've spent my life with the confidence that I'm smart enough to figure out pretty much anything, and that's a very powerful thing, both in work and in life. A big part of that goes back to the year I repeated kindergarten, and so I am very thankful for that decision. I still haven't told you why that decision was made, though, and the reason why is very complicated to me. It was my father's decision. I heard later that he didn't think that I was mature enough for first grade. When I first learned that fact, it wounded me. It felt like one more example of something I experienced frequently growing up, my father judging me and finding me lacking. There are 3 things I never heard from him until much later in life. He never said he loved me, he never talked about something I was good at, and he never gave me his approval. He would, however, often tell me where and how I was wrong. Looking back at it now, I can say that his love language was instruction. He'd act mostly uninterested in me until I made some mistake, and then he'd jump in with a description of what I should have done instead. So I laughed when I first heard the reason why he thought I needed to repeat kindergarten, because it seemed ridiculous. Of course, a 6-year-old boy will be immature because he's 6 years old. But there was a bitterness in my laughter because, as always, his judgment hurt. Eventually, I was able to see that when my father judged me, he was really judging the parts of himself that he didn't like very much. When he looked at me, he saw a younger version of himself. And toward the end of his life, I could sometimes see him working really hard to give me a little bit of what he wasn't able to offer when I was young. But it's still difficult for me, and so when I first thought of this life event as my answer to your question, I struggled with it. Part of me wanted to reject the idea. How could I be thankful for my father's judgment? I really didn't want to say that I was thankful to him for doing that. But when I thought about it, I could see something deeper and I think more important. In saying that I am thankful that he made that decision, I am not agreeing with his judgment. I still think that was wrong. Until I was in my 20s, he had trouble seeing past my faults, and that wasn't what I needed from him. His decision turned out well, but it did so in a way that I believe my father probably did not anticipate. However, I can still be thankful for a bad thing that had a good outcome. When we're young, and it's Christmas or our birthday, someone gives us a gift, and our parents tell us, "Say thank you." This is our first lesson in thankfulness. Someone gives us something nice, and in return, we give them thanks. As we get older, though, I think it's a good lesson to practice the art of being thankful for the bad stuff, too. Because good things don't just come out of good. Sometimes good comes out of bad. good outcomes can grow out of bad intentions. I'd like to be the sort of person who can be thankful for all of it, both the good and the bad. I would like to be someone who can look past a bad thing to see the good that might come out of it. And so that's my answer to your question.
Wow, Mark, that's a really profound story. And I'm sorry you went first because I can't top that. But I have a lot of thoughts about what you said. First, thanks for saying it. Really honest. And this is the level of personal detail that I wondered whether we'd get to in an episode like this. And I'm glad you went there. I think it's like very Buddhist of you to be thankful for bad things. You know, that's an enlightened view. My father-in-law, who died just a few weeks ago, converted to Buddhism in adulthood, and that was a big thing that he believed in too. He would say he was thankful for the Parkinson's that he got and that eventually killed him. Yeah. And so I think there's something to that to begin with.
Yeah.
But I also think it's really magnanimous of you to say that your father's love language was instruction, because I think a lot of people would be bitter about the parenting they received based on what you shared about your father's parenting style. So That's kind of remarkable to me as well.
Well, thank you for saying that. I certainly spent plenty of time in bitterness. Probably when you first met me, I would have been pretty bitter about my father, but it's been a lifetime of reflecting on that relationship and who he was and who he wanted to be and who he tried to be, but he couldn't quite get there. And so it rounds out over time. I think time sands the rough edges off of our experiences.
Yeah. I do want to go back to the beginning of your story, just to kind of ask a question that perhaps I should have asked right after you finished the digression on hockey. The question is, doesn't it even out eventually? I am very surprised to hear this story about the January effect vis-a-vis hockey, because of course, when you're 6 and the other kids are 5, right? There's a profound potential effect. Like you said, you're bigger and stronger, you're 1 year smarter. But when you're 13 and they're 12, or when you're 16 and they're 15, I would think that the effect would have evened out by then. So I'm still quite surprised to hear about how many hockey players born in the early months of the year would get to the highest rung, you know, that there wouldn't be more kids born in October who just grew up a little bit later. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I think if those players had stayed on the same teams and in the same leagues, it would have evened out eventually. If you imagine the scenario of not a kid who's just good at hockey, but a young kid who is great at hockey, he's going to get in on traveling teams, for instance. He's going to get a paid coach because his parents think, this guy has a future for him. So he is more likely to stand out in a way that sticks. So that I think that can lend itself to just acquiring the skills and the training and the reinforcement that you need in order to get out of the track of just being a good club player and actually becoming, a player with a professional prospect. And the other thing, which I did touch on in the original, which should always be reinforced, is just the power of believing something is possible.
Yes.
And if everyone is telling you that you're a star, especially at that age, you will believe that you are the star.
Yes.
And when you're out on the ice, you're going to expect the puck to come to you because you're the one who scores the goals. And I think that simple feeling can carry you a long way. It carried me a long way in a different avenue. And I think that's maybe one of the biggest advantages is that your very first hockey team, you're the best player.
Right.
And how that can affect how a child sees himself, how he carries himself, where he puts his time, I think it can be pretty profound.
Yeah, it's kind of like sets your trajectory at a higher plane than some other people. Yeah, I get that. I think there's a lot of truth to that. I would just point out, and this is maybe a different podcast for another time, but I also feel like there's a potential burden of expectations on that child, that person who's the best when they're 6.
Sure.
Then you become the brain, right? And you have to keep up that pace, and there can be quite a burden, and that could have negative effects as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think you and I both saw that at the University of Chicago back in the day. An entire freshman class filled with people who were probably the smartest or second smartest kid at their high school.
Yes.
And then suddenly, maybe they're not the smartest anymore.
Right.
I think there's a really interesting story to be told about resiliency, maybe a good podcast episode in the future.
Yes.
And you never see it play out so explicitly and so dramatically than freshman year at a really competitive college.
Yeah, but before we pivot to me, there's one more thing I want to say about your story, and it's kind of my own little personal anecdote. So when my children were approaching school age, I heard about this little, it's an overstatement to call it a scandal, but this little thing that happens in New York City public schools where parents kind of game the system. There are very strict rules about how old you should be when you enter kindergarten, but parents come up with excuses, medical and otherwise psychological, to have their children start a year late. And that kind of happens at a low level in every kindergarten class in New York. There's at least a couple kids who are there who are 6 years old instead of 5, like you were.
Mm-hmm.
And though your father's motivation was quite different, in this case, this is about purely gaming the system. And here's the anecdote part, about personal part for me. I thought this was a shocking thing to me, not because it was scandalous, but because I thought the opposite was true because of my own story. I'm born in late October, and when I started kindergarten, I was only 4 years old. I turned 5 in kindergarten, and I always thought that was an advantage for me, being thrown in with the older kids, you know, kind of like being thrown in the deep end of the pool.
Right.
You got to learn faster. You got to keep up. And I spent my entire life believing that I was advantaged and privileged because I was one of the youngest kids in my class. And then to get to this stage where I have children of my own and there are parents basically concocting ways to hold their kids back from starting kindergarten. I just thought that was crazy. But hearing your story makes me understand so much better what that's about.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe those parents had read Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. It's definitely a story that stuck with me. It is interesting that there's a different set of challenges by being thrown in the deep end, like you say. So instead of being given an early advantage over the other kids in school, you were thrown a bigger challenge than the other kids in the school.
Yes.
And set you down also a path of achievement, but from completely different starting point. It's interesting.
Yes, it is. And then just finally, I know we're very close in age, and I always wonder why you were 2 grades behind me in college. And now I know the answer to that. So thank you for solving that mystery as well.
Yes. Thanks, Dad.
Okay, well, on to my stories now. Not as profound as yours. I'm going to give you kind of more of a short list. My wife, as you know, is a college professor, and she's been complaining in recent days about how many of her students' final essays appear to have been written by a chatbot.
Yes.
How ridiculously full of platitudes they are and kind of obviously fake. And she inspired me, so I decided to ask Microsoft's Bing chatbot to answer this question. What am I most thankful for in this holiday season?
Okay.
And here's the first 2 sentences of its response. Quote, "That is a very personal and reflective question. I cannot answer it for you, as only you know what makes you grateful and happy." End quote.
Yep.
So who said chatbots were stupid?
They know when not to answer.
Yes, right. So, as I said, I'm not going to offer an exhaustive list of what I'm thankful for because I'm thankful for a lot of things. Instead, my list numbers 5 items, and it includes a few things that give my life meaning and a couple others that are in my thoughts right now for reasons I'll explain. Those who know me well might be surprised to hear that although I'm thankful for Juan Soto, the 25-year-old lefty-hitting superstar my beloved New York Yankees traded for earlier this month, he didn't make my short list.
Wow.
And that's because there's thankful and then there's thankful.
Mm.
So I expected that our lists would have some similarities, and you did mention your wife. Like you, my wife is at the top of my list. Words don't do justice here, but since she's paying me by the word, I'm going to try. But seriously, my wife is the most important person in my life and has been for nearly 3 decades. Our partnership means everything to me, in no small part because of what we've produced together, namely 2 wonderful children and a happy home full of love. I'm so thankful and grateful for my wife's love, but even more that she chooses me to love.
Yeah.
I rely on her judgment above that of all others, so if she thinks I'm worth loving, there must be something to that. I must be doing something right. This is no small matter for me. There was a time about half a life ago when I wondered whether I would ever find somebody with whom I could share my life. All these years later, I'm still surprised that I got so lucky. There's an element of there, but for the grace of God go I. You know what I mean?
No, very much so. Yeah. Similar situation. When I met my wife, I was seriously contemplating whether or not I was just going to be one of those guys who never really connects with anybody. And she somewhat miraculously chose me. And all these years later, I'm not entirely sure why, but she saw something and it's been enough to keep her around. And
yes.
Yeah, I couldn't be more thankful.
Yeah, so we seem to have that in common for sure. And speaking of getting lucky, that's a perfect segue for the second thing I'm thankful for, which is the accident of my birth. This one has been front of mind for me recently as I watch our world convulse from multiple wars, famines, and pestilence while reckoning with the simultaneous threats of quick annihilation from nuclear confrontation and slow death from climate catastrophe. In 1963, I was born a Caucasian male to reasonably financially secure and emotionally stable parents in the United States of America, the wealthiest country in the history of humankind, the world's longest surviving democracy, and a nation that strives, albeit somewhat fitfully, for freedom and equality. I could have been born in Hiroshima in 1945 or in Gaza this week. I could have lived my life in 14th century Europe amidst the bubonic plague. I might have been born a female under Taliban rule or a slave during the Middle Passage. Like Donald Trump Jr., I could have been the unloved child of a sociopath. And my father could have been a Mets fan. So what amazing luck that I avoided all those fates. I don't take that for granted.
Yeah. No, I get you. Every now and then when I'm feeling sorry for myself, I remember that I'm a middle-class white American male and therefore enjoy enormous advantages and that I kind of need to get over myself. I will say you can suffer any place in the world, but on the spectrum of suffering, I'm glad that unlike smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, I'm not forced to live on less than $2 a day.
Yes.
I have quite a bit more resources than that. And yes, lucky break, and I'm thankful for it.
Yes. Okay, that's the first 2. I might have overlooked my third nominee were it not for recent events in my life. As you know, Mark, I was laid off from my job of nearly 29 years a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
It's a job I landed almost by accident, working for an employer I respect in a position I enjoyed and was really good at. I had hoped and expected to retire from that job, and now, just like that, it's gone, and it's been truly devastating for me, as you know.
Yeah.
I'm really sad about it. I've cried a lot. But it's into that sinkhole of sadness that my village has appeared, with hands extended to pull me out. Since getting laid off, I've been contacted by dozens of friends and current and former colleagues to tell me how sorry they are about what happened, to remind me about how much I contributed to that organization, to offer advice, and to ping their contacts and help me brainstorm about what might come next. They've helped to give me perspective about my plight. One friend recited a wise song lyric that really helped put things in perspective. Quote, "Our life is more than our work, and our work is more than our jobs." End quote. My village has been there for me. And in calling it my village, I'm referring to the African proverb, "It takes a village to raise a child." In 2016, when she was running for president against Lord Voldemort, Hillary Clinton wrote a book called It Takes a Village and repeated the phrase in speeches and public appearances. Right-wingers took umbrage at the line, replying that it takes a family, as if, God forbid if us rugged individualist Americans ever accept help from a source outside our own flesh and blood.
Yeah.
As with most right-wing dogma, that's cruel and stupid. Of course it takes a village to raise the child, and also to lift this employee out of the clinical depression he was careening toward after being unceremoniously shown the door by his employer. And that's why I nominate my village, and yours, and that of everyone else who's sensible enough to have one, as the third thing I'm thankful for this holiday season.
Yeah, good choice. I feel like, as a person, a mistake I've frequently made is thinking that what is important is what you can do. Time and again, I'm reminded that what's truly important is who you know and how close you are to them. My own life events and what you've told me now just brings it back around, is that at the end of the day, the people who are there for you, your most critical resource, it's worth more than money in the bank.
Absolutely. Yes. All right, moving on. The fourth thing might be a corollary of the third. I'm going to call it the majority. I'm thankful for the majority of Americans who believe in a woman's right to choose, who think that guns do kill people and not regulating them is crazy, who don't support traitorous insurrections to overturn elections, who think voting rights should be protected, who think immigration makes our country stronger, and climate change is real, and vaccines are safe and effective, and rich people and corporations should pay more in taxes, etc., etc. This statistically provable sample of Americans has provided the majority of popular votes to Democratic presidential candidates in 7 of the last 8 national elections. Now, there's a lot of pessimism and outright fear circulating among Democrats right now about how he who must not be named is going to regain the presidency next year. I'm not one of those pessimists, because I know the good guys are in the majority, and the majority nearly always comes through for us when we need it. It will again in 2024, because it must. And I'm thankful for that.
Yeah, me too. I can relate to the feelings of trepidation. I just spent the morning with my sister and her husband, and if they're listening out there, hey, thanks for tuning in. But they are both convinced that a Trump win is inevitable and that civilization will fall into ruins shortly thereafter. I'm not joining them in that, partly for reasons and partly just because the life I want to lead is the one that's oriented on hope.
Yes.
And on a sense that people deep down are basically good. Those are 2 things that sustain me. And those 2 things in combination make me think that there'll be more good news than bad news next November. Until then, there'll be a lot of time to worry, but I agree. Most people are good. Most people are open to truth.
Yes.
Most people are not motivated by hate. And so, fingers crossed that they'll show up at the polls.
Yes. And reality is congruent with hope.
Yes, true. Yes. Hope is ultimately what shapes reality.
Yes. All right. Last but not least, I'm thankful for mansplaining. And to be more precise, I'm thankful for the opportunity to reconnect and collaborate with one of my best friends from college on a project that exercises my brain, increases my knowledge about the world, and hopefully provides edification and even a little pleasure to our listening audience. You and I have tried to collaborate on creative endeavors before in fits and starts, and I'm really thankful we started this during the pandemic and have managed to keep it going into a fourth year. Dude, this is our 82nd episode. How about that?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing, isn't it? Started out as just sort of a crazy, why not idea in the middle of the pandemic.
Yep.
Like I think I've mentioned on this podcast before, the pandemic made some people bake sourdough bread. It made us start a podcast.
Yes.
And they're not baking the bread anymore for the most part, but here we are still chugging along.
Yes.
And it's a great thing. I mean, yes, it's a chance to reconnect with you every couple of weeks, which is awesome.
Yes.
But it's also a chance to reconnect with the world and ask questions and discover new things and expand my mind and just feel like I have a better understanding of how things operate. And that in itself is worth being thankful for, just the outcome of the podcast. So we could have come up with a podcast that was talking through every episode of the original Star Trek. I think you probably would have agreed to do that.
Yes.
But I'm kind of glad that we did this one instead because it's really worked out well.
Yep. I'm really thankful for it, and I hope we can keep this going, despite what happens in our lives as we move along here.
You and me both.
All right. Well, that puts a bow on this episode. You have a question for me for next time, though, right?
Yes, I do. We just spent an episode looking back, so I'd like to kick off 2024 with an episode that looks forward. A couple of days ago, I saw an article that predicted 2024 would be, quote, the year of robots, unquote. And I feel like we've been hearing a lot about robots for a pretty long time. Robot cars come to mind, and robot vacuums.
Yes.
And those YouTube videos of creepy robot dogs navigating difficult terrain.
Not to mention which we've done a couple of podcast episodes about robots already, like the autonomous drones and autonomous cars.
Yeah. But still, the years keep going by, and yet robots like we saw in the Jetsons are definitely not part of our daily life. So my question, Joe, why does robotics develop more slowly than AI? And are we, in fact, poised right on the edge of a robotics revolution that would touch on our individual personal lives rather than be something we see in headlines?
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good question. I'd like to know the answer to it myself, so I'll get on that, and I'll let you know next time.
Okay.
Okay, folks, if you have any thoughts about this episode of Mansplaining, you want to comment on this episode or any other, please go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast. That's where you can like us, check our sources, leave a comment or question about what you just heard, and you could also suggest topics for future episodes. We welcome and appreciate any and all feedback you might want to share with us. You can find this podcast pretty much wherever you listen to podcasts: Apple, Google, Amazon, Spotify, Buzzsprout, and many others. You can also give us a 5-star rating if you like what you heard. Or you can call us at 206-486-4074 and leave us a voicemail message with your question or comment. But that's a wrap for this episode. Thanks for listening. That was Mark, and I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you then. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.